The engineer they almost didn't admit scored lower on the Coalition Technical Assessment than any candidate in the Meridian Station Academy's 43-year history. The Intake Review Board had processed his application twice, assuming a data entry error the first time. There wasn't one. The Meridian Station Academy for Advanced Systems Integration existed at the outer edge of Coalition-controlled space, where the distance from the core worlds made it either an inconvenient posting or an opportunity, depending on what kind of person was being asked. It trained engineers, systems architects, and technical officers for the Coalition fleet, drawing candidates from 31 member species across 9 star systems. The program was rigorous by design and competitive by necessity. The ships those graduates would eventually crew were complicated enough that the margin between a competent engineer and an excellent one was sometimes measured in lives. The Academy's primary evaluation metric for incoming cadets was the Coalition Technical Assessment, a standardized examination that tested mathematical reasoning, systems logic, materials science, propulsion theory, and applied problem-solving across a 500-question adaptive format that had been in use with periodic revisions for 31 years. Scores were reported on a scale of 1 to 1,000. The cohort average for the incoming class of the current term was 612. The highest score belonged to a Vethsoran candidate named Araval Os, who had scored 941 and arrived at orientation with a data portfolio that the admissions office had forwarded to 3 separate faculty members without comment. In the way that faculty receive materials, they are not sure how to categorize. The lowest score belonged to Cale Morrow. Cale Morrow had scored 287 on the Coalition Technical Assessment. He was 26 years old. He was from a mid-tier settlement on the outer reach of the Callaway Belt, a stretch of industrial habitats and salvage stations that the Coalition Mapping Authority had classified as permanently peripheral, which was the bureaucratic way of saying that nobody important had ever found a reason to go there. He was average height, unremarkably built, and had arrived at orientation in a jacket that had been repaired in 4 places, which was either a poverty indicator or a preference, and which the intake administrator who logged his arrival had noted in the file with the specific neutrality of someone who had decided it wasn't her job to decide which. His written application, which was technically optional but reviewed when submitted, had been 3 paragraphs. The admissions committee had read it. 2 members had flagged it for follow-up. 1 had not. The 2 who flagged it had done so because Cale Morrow's application described, in plain and precise language, 12 years of independent engineering work conducted without formal training, without Coalition standard tools, and without access to the theoretical frameworks that the technical assessment was designed to measure. He had grown up in a salvage station. His father had run it, and his father before that. The Callaway Belt stations operated on equipment that the core worlds had retired before Cale was born, maintained through methods that the Academy's curriculum did not cover, because the Academy's curriculum had been written for equipment that worked the way it was supposed to. The 3rd committee member, who had not flagged the application, had noted in the review file, "Candidate does not demonstrate Coalition standard technical foundation." He had recommended conditional admission with remedial coursework requirements. Cale had been admitted conditionally. The remedial coursework requirements had been attached to his registration file in the way that institutional judgments are attached to people, quietly, comprehensively, and with the specific permanence of a category that, once applied, tended to follow. The Academy's primary practical evaluation was called the Systems Trial. It was the engineering equivalent of what other institutions might have called a competition, except that it was not framed as a competition because the faculty who ran it preferred to describe it as a collaborative diagnostic exercise, which was a framing that nobody involved, faculty or cadet, took seriously. The systems trial paired cadets in 2-person teams to diagnose and resolve a simulated critical systems failure in a standardized engineering scenario. Teams were evaluated on accuracy, methodology, and time to resolution. Rankings were posted publicly on the Academy's internal network. They were updated after each trial. They were in practice the primary social document of the Academy's technical hierarchy. At the beginning of the current term, with 188 cadets enrolled across 6 species, the rankings ran from first to last in a way that tracked almost perfectly with CTA scores. Araval Os held first. The handful of human cadets enrolled in the program were distributed across the lower third. Cale Morrow was at the bottom. He was specifically at the bottom by a margin that the ranking system had not previously produced. The gap between his preliminary diagnostic scores and the cadet ranked immediately above him was larger than the gap between first and 53rd. The professor who administered the preliminary evaluations had checked the numbers twice and then forwarded them to the department head without annotation, which was his way of making something someone else's problem. The system's trial challenge structure worked on a straightforward principle. Any cadet could formally request a paired diagnostic against any other cadet, with ranking positions exchanged based on outcome. Lower-ranked cadets challenging upward was common and expected. The gap between last and first was, as a practical matter, large enough that the administrative expectation was that a cadet in Cale Morrow's position would work through the intermediate rankings before the differential became meaningfully smaller. Cale had submitted a challenge request in the third week of the term, not against the cadet ranked directly above him, against Araval Os. The challenge request had passed through the system automatically because the rules did not prohibit it. Professor Audra Thenick, who oversaw the system's trial scheduling, had approved it within the hour and assigned it to the Academy's primary simulation bay, which seated observers and had a full recording array. She had done this because she expected it to be instructive. The Academy's lower-ranked cadets periodically needed to understand why the assessment categories existed. A practical demonstration of the gap between a 287 and a 941 tended to be more effective than any amount of remedial coursework. The assignment of the primary simulation bay meant the trial was open to observation. 73 cadets attended. This was notable. Paired diagnostics in secondary bays drew 6 to 12 observers on a busy day. 73 was the kind of number that a particular kind of event produces, the kind of event that an institution has already decided the outcome of, and whose audience arrives less to watch something uncertain than to witness something inevitable. The scenario parameters were standard. A mid-scale vessel engineering failure, fleet specification, multiple interdependent system faults, time-sensitive resolution window. Both teams received the scenario simultaneously. Standard rules of engagement applied. No external references, no communication with non-team members, no access to coalition technical databases. The work was to be done with what each cadet carried in their head. Araval Os began immediately. That was his documented pattern across every prior trial, and it was what the cadets who had studied his methodology expected. He identified the primary fault signature within the first 90 seconds, which was faster than any previous trial record. His approach was precise, coalition standard, elegant in the way that the Academy's curriculum produced. Systematic fault isolation, primary pathway resolution, cascading dependency check. It was the methodology that the program had been designed to teach, and that Araval had absorbed and exceeded in a way that made watching him work feel less like observation and more like studying a proof. Cale did not begin immediately. He spent 40 seconds looking at the scenario display, not reading it the way cadets looked at scenarios when processing, looking at it the way someone looks at something they recognize from somewhere else. His hands were at his sides. His partner, a third-year cadet named Brennan Okoro, who had been assigned to Cale's team by rotation, and who had spent the previous 2 days quietly informing anyone who would listen that he considered this a waste of his term record, was already at his station and entering preliminary diagnostic commands. What happened in the next 11 minutes was recorded by the simulation bay's array and reviewed, in the days following, by 7 members of the Academy's technical faculty with varying degrees of disbelief and 1 member with something closer to recognition. Cale began with the ventilation routing. This was wrong by the Academy's methodology. Ventilation was a tertiary system. The primary fault signature in the scenario was clearly a propulsion cascade, and the correct diagnostic sequence began with propulsion isolation. Every cadet in the room who was watching his display understood immediately that Cale Morrow had begun in the wrong place, which confirmed what the pre-trial conversation in the observer seating had established as consensus, except that the ventilation routing, in this specific scenario, had been carrying the thermal bleed from the primary fault in a pattern that was not visible in the standard diagnostic readout, but was producing a secondary pressure variance in the life support coupling that, if the primary fault was resolved without addressing the thermal bleed first, would result in a cascading failure across 3 additional systems within 4 minutes of the apparent fix. This was the scenario's hidden fault. It was the component that the scenario designers had included specifically to differentiate good diagnosticians from excellent ones. It was visible if you knew where to look. It was not visible through the standard coalition fault isolation methodology. Because the standard methodology had been designed for fleet standard equipment, and fleet standard equipment managed thermal bleed through a regulated pathway that had been a coalition design requirement since before the Callaway Belt stations had acquired their first retired fleet vessel. On salvage station equipment, thermal bleed migrated. It followed pressure differentials through whatever pathways were available. Because salvage station equipment had not been built to the specifications that assumed clean thermal management, and it had been maintained by people who had learned to look for it in places the manuals didn't mention. Cale's father had taught him to look for thermal bleed before touching anything else. His father had learned it from a burn scar on his left forearm from the one time he hadn't. The lesson had been transmitted precisely once and had not required repetition. Cale addressed the thermal bleed in 2 minutes and 17 seconds. His methodology was not in any coalition technical manual. It was also correct. He then resolved the primary propulsion fault, then the secondary electrical routing fault, then the life support coupling variance that the thermal bleed had been feeding, which in the scenario's logic was now contained rather than building. His partner Okoro, who had begun the trial ready to document Cale's failures for the benefit of his own trial record, had stopped entering commands 8 minutes in and was watching Cale's screen with the specific stillness of someone whose understanding of a situation has changed faster than their expression has caught up with. Araval Oss completed his scenario resolution in 14 minutes and 40 seconds. This was the fastest resolution time in the program's current term. It was, by the Academy's evaluation rubric, an excellent performance. Cale's team completed their resolution in 11 minutes and 3 seconds. The scenario's hidden fault in Araval's resolution triggered at the 14-minute mark. The simulation logged it automatically. Secondary cascade initiated, resolution incomplete, critical failure flag. Under the trial's evaluation criteria, a critical failure flag after an apparent resolution constituted an incomplete. The scenario had been resolved. It had also technically not been fully resolved. The resolution time differential was 3 minutes and 37 seconds in Cale's favor. The fault identification differential was the hidden component which Cale's resolution had contained and Araval's had not. The observer seating was quiet in a way that the room's acoustics made very clear. 73 cadets who had arrived expecting a particular outcome were processing a different one, and doing so in the specific silence of people who have not yet decided what the thing they just watched means. Cale looked at the completed scenario display for a moment. Then he logged the resolution, closed his station, and walked toward the exit at the pace of someone with somewhere else to be. He paused at the door. Not to look at the observers and not at the scoreboard, though it had updated by then. He looked at the scenario display for a moment longer, the way someone looks at a problem they've seen before in a different shape. Then he walked through the door. In the scoring database, the ranking update processed automatically. First place, Cale Morrow. Evaluation note, full scenario resolution, hidden fault contained, time to completion 11:3. Professor Thenick did not speak immediately after the trial concluded. She stood in the observation tier with the particular stillness of someone who has said something at a faculty meeting that has become, in retrospect, significantly ill-timed. Specifically, she had said at the beginning of term that the remedial coursework attached to Morrow's file would likely not be sufficient to bridge the gap between his assessment score and the program standards. She had said it to 2 colleagues. One of them was standing next to her. Neither of them mentioned it. The faculty member who reviewed the trial record with something closer to recognition was Dr. Pavan Haas, who had been with the program for 19 years and who had spent a portion of that time early in his career on a research posting to an outer reach industrial cluster not entirely unlike the Callaway Belt. He had submitted, after reviewing the recording, a request to examine Cale Morrow's application file in full, specifically the section detailing the 12 years of independent work. He had read it carefully. Then he had forwarded it to 2 colleagues with a note that said only, "Read the maintenance logs." The application had included, appended to the 3-paragraph statement, 14 pages of handwritten maintenance logs from the salvage station. They documented in sequence every significant repair conducted on the station's primary systems over the course of 12 years, with fault identification, resolution methodology, materials used, time to complete, and outcome. They were not written in coalition technical language. They were written in the specific shorthand of someone who had learned engineering the way the Callaway Belt had always taught it. By necessity, without margin for error, and without access to the methodologies that assumed you were working with equipment that behaved the way it was supposed to. Dr. Haas had looked at those logs. He had then looked at the scenario fault structure from the trial. He had then looked at the logs again. The thermal bleed migration pattern that Cale had identified in 11 seconds. Not minutes, seconds, the trial recording was precise, was documented in the maintenance logs from 11 years prior. Same fault family, different equipment, same underlying principle which his father had taught him and which the station's equipment had reinforced through a decade of repetition. The Academy's technical assessment did not test for this. It had never needed to, because the assessment had been written for cadets who had grown up in systems where thermal bleed was managed by design rather than by knowledge. The 287 that Cale had scored was not a measure of his capability. It was a measure of the distance between what the assessment asked and what he knew. Dr. Haas submitted a formal review request to the program's admissions committee 2 weeks after the trial. It was 3 pages. The first page documented the trial outcome. The second page documented the fault identification timeline and its relationship to the maintenance logs. The third page was a recommendation. It read in part, "The Coalition Technical Assessment does not account for engineering traditions developed outside the framework of Coalition standard equipment. The candidate's demonstrated capability significantly exceeds what the assessment was designed to measure, and the gap between his CTA score and his trial performance is not an anomaly. It is a documentation of the assessment's limitation, not the candidate's." He did not mention the remedial coursework in the recommendation. Some things were better handled by allowing the record to speak for itself. Cale Morrow's file was updated 3 days after the recommendation was submitted. The remedial coursework requirement was removed. The notation in the admissions section that had read conditional admission, assessment score below program standard, was amended. The new notation read, "See trial record, term 1. Cale was not informed of the update directly. He found out the way cadets find out most things at the Academy, through the internal network, in the course of checking something else. He read the update, noted it, and returned to the salvage station schematics he had been studying, which were not part of any coursework, and which he had requested from the Academy's technical archive, because he wanted to see how the Callaway Belt's equipment differed from the Coalition standard, at the design level, rather than only at the level of how it behaved when it failed. The schematics were classified as historical interest only. Nobody had requested them in 11 years. Brennan Okoro, whose team record now included a first-place trial finish that he had contributed to primarily by staying out of the way, had attempted to explain his role in the trial to 2 separate people in the week following, and had found the explanation increasingly difficult to make coherent. He had eventually stopped attempting it. Araval Oss had reviewed the trial recording once, the evening it was released. He had watched the 11 minutes without comment. Then he had submitted a challenge request to Cale Morrow for the following term's secondary trial. The request was direct and carried no notation, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone who understood what they had seen and had decided to respond to it by preparing rather than by disputing. In the program's ranking record, the update from that trial remained. First place. Resolution time, 11:3, hidden fault contained. Below it, in the evaluation notes field, a staff member had entered a secondary notation while processing the record. It was not required by the evaluation rubric. It was the kind of addition that happens when someone reviewing a document decides that the official record does not fully capture what actually occurred. It read, "Fault identification methodology, non-standard. Outcome complete." The Callaway Belt, for its part, continued to operate on equipment that the Coalition Core Worlds had retired before Cale was born. The people who maintained it continued to learn what they needed to learn from the equipment itself, in the way that the equipment had always taught. Through failure, through repair, through the specific transmission of knowledge that happens when what you know is the only thing standing between a functioning system and one that isn't. Cale's father ran the station the same way his father had run it. He had received, forwarded to the station's communication terminal by the Academy's administrative office, a copy of the trial result with no covering note. He had read it once. Then he had gone back to the relay coupling he had been repairing, which had a thermal bleed migration pattern he had identified that morning, and which needed to be addressed before the main power cycle ran at end of shift. He knew how to find it. He had always known how to find it. He had made sure his son knew, too.